At the will reading, my parents wore those familiar smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The kind of smiles that weighed more than silence. My sister, Elise, accepted a check for $10 million with a polished grace that seemed rehearsed, almost as if she had anticipated every step of this moment. And me? I got nothing. Not a glance, not a word. My father, Howard, avoided my eyes as though the mere sight of me could disrupt his carefully curated world. My mother, Lillian, smirked, an expression that always felt like a private joke at my expense. Some children are invisible, she seemed to say. I clenched my fists under the table, the edges of the envelope I had hoped to receive digging into my palms. The lawyer, a gray-haired man named Martin Kells, shuffled through his papers with deliberate precision. The room smelled faintly of polished mahogany and perfume, an aroma that had always accompanied manipulation in my family. I had sat through countless family gatherings, formal dinners where every word was calculated, and now this, the culmination of years of playing a part one never auditioned for. My name never appeared first, never even in passing. Then Martin paused, clearing his throat. His voice held a subtle tension that hadn't been there moments ago. "There is one more document," he said. The air in the room shifted. Lillian's posture stiffened, Howard's hands tightened behind his back, and Elise tilted her head. Curiosity mingled with entitlement. The envelope he drew from his leather case was cream-colored, sealed with red wax bearing my grandfather's crest. I felt my heart stall. The handwriting was unmistakable, each deliberate slant of the letters carrying the weight of decades. I had spent countless afternoons as a child perched on the edge of my grandfather's desk, tracing the ink of his meticulous notes, learning the rhythm of observation, patience, and care. And now, this handwriting called me back to those days I tried to bury beneath layers of disappointment and dismissal. Martin broke the seal. The letter inside was addressed directly to me. He read aloud, though I barely heard the words at first, lost in the flood of memory. Gideon Hawthorne had entrusted me with the Hawthorne Ecological Laboratory, the building, the equipment, the accounts, and every patent under its name. Unconditional. Unquestioned. My stomach tightened, disbelief giving way to a cautious spark of hope. The room reacted instantly. Lillian's smile faltered and then cracked, a brittle edge to her otherwise polished mask. Howard's jaw tightened, and Elise leaned forward, stripping away the nonchalance she usually wore as armor. No one had expected this. The one my grandfather trusted above all, the one he had quietly observed, nurtured, and believed in, was me. The weight of that responsibility pressed against my ribs in a way money never could. I remember the drive back to the city's outskirts, where the lab sat on land most had written off as worthless. Pines lined a dusty road, their needles brushing against the roof of my car, like whispers of a promise only I had been given. The building rose among them, timber siding weathered to a soft gray, steel beams supporting expansive windows that captured every shaft of sunlight. The air smelled of earth, cedar, and something untamed, a stark contrast to the sterile halls of my family's mansion. Inside, the lab breathed with life. Rows of test beds held flourishing crops, seedlings that had grown under careful observation, and hives that buzzed a rhythm as steady and impartial as the universe itself. I moved through the space quietly, savoring the scent of damp soil and the low hum of life thriving without pretense. Here, I was not a son, a brother, or failure. I was a guardian. I opened Gideon's office, my fingers brushing over familiar wood. The desk still nicked from years of careful use. On the shelves, notebooks in his unmistakable ink chronicled years of observation, meticulous records, and lessons meant only for me. One note, in particular, caught my eye. "Keep watching. The world needs your eyes." The thought settled over me like armor. I had been invisible to them, dismissed, excluded. Yet here lay proof of my worth in the very work my grandfather had entrusted to me. This was not about inheritance alone. It was about stewardship, responsibility, and a quiet justice that comes from honoring a legacy others would rather see buried. And so I began to plan, not with anger or vengeance, but with the sharp, deliberate patience that Gideon had instilled in me from my earliest days. This laboratory, its secrets, and the life it nurtured would not be threatened by greed or manipulation. I would protect it. I would outmaneuver those who believed the world belonged to them simply by virtue of blood. And in doing so, I would finally see my worth reflected, not in their eyes, but in the living world my grandfather had left for me. The first night in the lab was quieter than I expected. Outside, the pine trees whispered with the wind, and the hive's gentle hum blended with the distant croak of frogs in the marsh. I had spent years imagining this moment, picturing the lab as a sanctuary, and yet reality had a way of making anticipation feel like a fragile illusion. I set down the stack of notebooks I had taken from Gideon's office and ran my hands over the worn spines, feeling the indentation of ink on paper, the faint smell of old earth and knowledge pressed into their pages. These were not just records. They were a map to understanding a life dedicated to stewardship and a quiet rebellion against a family obsessed with appearances. The call logs caught my attention again. I had barely glanced at them during the will reading, dismissing them as a minor detail compared to the enormity of what I had inherited. But now, in the safety of the lab, I could see their pattern. Missed calls, blocked numbers, repeated attempt at contact that never reached me. Each entry was a careful manipulation, evidence that my family had worked quietly to cut me out of the network my grandfather had nurtured. Anger flickered, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't just a family feud. It was a test of patience and strategy, and I had learned from the master himself that impulsive reactions were dangerous. By morning, I had set up a perimeter of sensors and cameras, subtle but effective. They would record movement without being noticed, feeding data to a secure server in the office. Every corner, every blind spot was accounted for. I moved to the lab, cataloging equipment, checking storage rooms, and familiarizing myself with the plants and test beds. Sunlight streamed to the glass roof, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air, each one a tiny reminder that life persisted even in the face of neglect and greed. It was during this inspection that I noticed the first real sign that someone had been here. A moisture sensor was missing from its hook, a small, almost inconsequential device. Yet it screamed intrusion. My heart rate quickened, but I kept my voice calm, my movements deliberate. The labs had been quiet for years, save for my grandfather's presence. Now, the stillness had been violated, a reminder that others had eyes on this place long before I stepped through the door. I spent hours tracing the security feed, scrolling through late-night hours, grainy images that revealed a figure slipping between shadows. I recognized the gait, the careful, measured steps of someone who knew the layout intimately. My sister's assistant, the one who had helped her manipulate records and gain insider knowledge. The intrusion was minor, yet confirmed a truth I had long suspected. The family would not simply accept the will's terms. They would act, quietly, methodically, to undermine me. The realization brought a strange mix of fear and determination. I was not naive. I knew the power dynamics at play, the lengths to which my mother and sister would go to maintain control. But the lab was more than just property. It was a testament to my grandfather's vision. Every seedling, every journal entry, every carefully calibrated experiment was a line of defense, a reminder that stewardship could be stronger than greed. I began a thorough inventory, cataloging every piece of equipment and every sample. Each vial, each folder became a small fortress against intrusion. I documented everything, knowing that the more precise my records, the harder it would be for anyone to challenge my authority over the lab. And in this meticulous work, I found a rhythm, a quiet satisfaction that steadied my nerves and sharpened my focus. By evening, I sat at the desk in Gideon's office, surrounded by the tools of his life's work. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the room, and I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. I could see the pattern now, the web of interference and secrecy spun by my family. Every block call, every missed message, every quiet manipulation. They were all attempts to erase me from the lineage my grandfather had valued above all else. But I was not invisible. I was not powerless. I had inherited more than property. I had inherited a vision, a network of knowledge, and the faith of someone who had devoted his life to seeing the world through curious eyes. And now, it was my turn to protect it. Late that night, I reviewed the security footage again, frame by frame. The intruder had paused near the office wing, as if making a note, and then retreated. I made a mental note to enhance that section of the surveillance grid, adding redundant motion sensors, and micro cameras that would capture even the subtlest movement. Every precaution, every detail was part of a larger plan. By the time I locked the lab for the night, the hum of the hives was my only company. Bees moved with a quiet purpose that humans often lacked, trading heat in winter, passing sweetness from mouth to mouth, and building a world from borrowed light. I watched them until my own breathing matched their rhythm, a meditative cadence that reminded me of why I was here. Not for wealth, not for family approval, but to honor the legacy entrusted to me. In the early hours, a notification pinged on my phone. Talia, a colleague from my grandfather's earlier projects, had sent a brief message. "Something's off. Keep an eye." I didn't respond immediately. Not yet. The fewer people involved, the safer it was. Every move had to be deliberate, every step calculated. I closed the office door, secured the locks, and let the quiet of the lab envelop me. Tomorrow, I thought, I would begin to unravel the deeper layers of their interference, tracking not just intrusions, but the very network of manipulation that had sought to keep me blind. And as I settled into a chair by the window, watching the night settle over the pines and marsh, I felt a strange sense of calm. The battle had begun, but it was mine to orchestrate. The lab, the legacy, the life my grandfather had fought to protect. They were all within my grasp. And no amount of deceit, greed, or familial ambition could take that from me. Not while I kept watching. The following morning, the lab felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Sunlight streamed through the tall greenhouse windows, illuminating every row of plants, every carefully labeled sample. I walked slowly between the test beds, tracing the patterns of growth my grandfather had meticulously cultivated. Each leaf, each sprout, told a story of patience, experimentation, and care, qualities my family had dismissed in me for years. Yet here in this space, they were the only things that mattered. I began my rounds with a methodical approach, inspecting every irrigation line, every nutrient meter, every soil sample. Each device was checked twice, every calibration noted in my own handwriting. I was documenting more than just inventory. I was creating a digital fingerprint of the lab, a record that could withstand any attempt to claim ownership or discredit my authority. This was the start of my defense, the first move in a game my family didn't even realize had begun. By mid-morning, I started reviewing the call logs in detail. The pattern was unmistakable. Every unanswered message, every block number, was a strategic erasure. Someone had intentionally kept me out of the loop, severing the connection between me and the people who had been vital to the lab's functioning. My stomach turned, not from anger, but from the clarity of what I was up against. This wasn't mere oversight. It was manipulation, carefully executed over months, perhaps even years. I pulled up the server feed and began tracing the intrusions from the night before. The footage was grainy, but the movements were deliberate. The assistant from my sister's office, familiar with the layout, had paused at specific points, almost as if he were mapping the space in preparation for future access. My mind raced, but I forced calm. Panic had no place here. Each intrusion was a clue, a piece of a puzzle I was now determined to solve. I decided to implement a multi-layered security system. Micro cameras were hidden in plain sight, motion sensors added to blind corners, and access codes to the office were strengthened and made multi-tiered. Every step I took was deliberate, every precaution calculated to prevent further interference. The lab was no longer just a sanctuary. It had become a fortress, a place where my grandfather's work could continue unhindered. By afternoon, I was joined by Talia, my grandfather's former research assistant. She arrived quietly, carrying a folder of documents that had been overlooked during the will reading. Her presence was a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this. She trusted me, and more importantly, she understood the stakes. We moved through the lab together, reviewing experiments, noting potential weaknesses in both our security and our oversight. Her insight was invaluable, revealing details I might have missed on my own. As the day wore on, I began noticing small anomalies, missing tools, papers slightly displaced, subtle signs that someone had been inside when we weren't looking. The realization was chilling, but also empowering. Each act of interference told me exactly what they valued, where they thought they could gain leverage, and what needed immediate protection. I cataloged everything meticulously, knowing that a record of these intrusions would serve as both evidence and strategy. By evening, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the greenhouse floor. I sat in Gideon's office, reviewing the accumulated data, and felt a sense of determination settle over me. The lab was more than a collection of patents and equipment. It was a testament to philosophy, a vision that my grandfather had nurtured quietly, deliberately, and with unwavering integrity. Protecting it meant more than defending property. It meant preserving a legacy of knowledge, of stewardship, of understanding the intricate balance between life and human intervention. Night fell and the lab grew quiet, the hum of the bees the only constant sound. I leaned back in the chair, tracing the edges of Gideon's notebooks, reflecting on the trust he had placed in me. Every word, every note, every instruction had been meant to prepare me for this very moment. And now, the challenge was not just to maintain a lab, but to outmaneuver a family that had spent a lifetime perfecting manipulation, control, and illusion of superiority. I reviewed the call logs one last time before sleep, each misconnection, each block number, telling the story of exclusion, but also revealing patterns I could use to anticipate their next moves. The first night had been a warning, the following day, a blueprint for strategy. And as I locked the lab doors and watched the night settle over the pines, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer a passive inheritance. It was a war over knowledge, trust, and legacy, and I was fully awake, fully prepared, and fully determined to win it. The following morning brought a tense calm. The lab, bathed in the soft golden light of dawn, appeared peaceful, but I knew better. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards hinted at the subtle war unfolding around me. My grandfather had always taught me that knowledge was both shield and weapon. I needed to see clearly, anticipate moves before they happened, and prepare for what was coming. I began by reviewing the security footage from the previous night, frame by frame. The assistant had returned. This time, he moved with more confidence, almost as if he had discovered new blind spots to exploit. I watched him hesitate near the cabinet where I stored the printed call logs. My stomach tightened. Someone was trying to map the lab in detail, to understand exactly what information they could access and what evidence could be erased. I made a mental note. These were not amateurs. They were calculating every step. Talia arrived mid-morning, her eyes sharp and focused. She had been reviewing old project files and cross-referencing them with recent experiments. Together, we discovered anomalies in the sample logs. Several soil samples were missing or swapped with placeholders, and one of the nutrient monitoring devices had been tampered with. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to disrupt months of data. Whoever was behind this had insider knowledge. It was my family's interference, but the sophistication suggested professional assistance. We worked methodically, documenting every irregularity, reinforcing access points, and setting traps of our own. Micro cameras were repositioned to catch even the faintest movement, and motion sensors were tuned to trigger alerts for the smallest vibrations. Every corner of the lab became a chessboard, with me planning several moves ahead, ensuring that any intrusion would not go unnoticed. I realized then that my grandfather had left me more than a lab. He had left me a challenge. To protect it, I needed cunning as much as knowledge. By afternoon, a subtle tension settled over the lab. I was moving to the rows of test beds, cataloging plant growth, when I noticed something odd about the irrigation schedule. The automated system had been tampered with, delivering water to only half the rows, leaving some plants dangerously dry. I traced the manipulation to a remote login, likely executed during the night. Someone was testing me, probing weaknesses. I felt a flicker of both anger and satisfaction. They thought they could outmaneuver me, but every attempt only revealed more about their methods. Talia suggested we begin a full audit of both digital and physical assets. We created a secure archive, duplicating sensitive files and embedding digital markers that could trace any unauthorized access. This wasn't just protection, it was intelligence gathering. I could predict that if my family or their associates accessed the wrong file, it would leave a breadcrumb trail straight to them. Every action I took was now strategic, designed to anticipate their next move while keeping the lab operational. Late in the day, I decided to inspect the lab grounds. Walking between the rows of flowering plants, I noticed faint footprints in the soft soil near the greenhouse edge. They were narrow, deliberate, like the trace of someone trying to avoid detection, yet careless enough to leave evidence. My heart raced. Whoever had come here wasn't just curious. They were preparing for a larger incursion. I photographed the prints, noting size, depth, and direction. This would become another piece of the puzzle, a record of intrusion that could be used to confront those who sought to undermine me. Night fell, and the lab grew silent except for the faint hum of the hives. I sat in Gideon's office, reviewing the day's discoveries. Every tampering, every unauthorized login, every subtle intrusion was a lesson in patience and strategy. My grandfather's legacy was fragile, not because it lacked value, but because it represented knowledge and vision that others wanted to manipulate for their own gain. I realized that protecting it meant thinking like both guardian and strategist, blending caution with calculated risk. As midnight approached, I activated the motion alerts and adjusted the camera angles once more. The lab was quiet, almost serene, but I knew that would not last. The family had tasted opportunity, and they would not relent. Each intruder, each probe, was a warning, a challenge. I would need to move faster, smarter, and with unflinching precision. I reviewed the call logs again, noting patterns and timing, and began drafting a strategy to use their own actions against them. Any attempt to access or manipulate the lab would now feed into my broader plan, documenting everything, tracking every movement, and preparing to expose not just their attempts, but the full scale of their deception. By the time I finally allowed myself to rest, the hum of the bees outside had settled into a soothing rhythm. I closed my eyes briefly, imagining the quiet strength of Gideon's vision, the perseverance and diligence he had instilled in me. The lab was more than a place. It was a testament, a living proof that dedication, intellect, and careful observation could withstand even the most persistent attempts at sabotage. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I knew that the next day would demand not just vigilance, but action. Morning came with a restless sense of anticipation. The lab, still bathed in dawn's soft light, felt like a calm before a storm. I moved through the rows of plants, checking automated watering schedules, measuring soil moisture, and cross-referencing growth logs with previous weeks. Every row, every plant was a living ledger of my grandfather's meticulous work. Yet, beneath the hum of the greenhouse and the chirping of hidden sensors, I felt a pulse of unease. My family had tasted opportunity. They knew that the lab wasn't just a collection of patents, it was power. I reviewed the motion sensor data from the previous night while sipping lukewarm coffee. Every trigger, every alert told a story. The intruder had returned, bolder this time, pausing near sensitive equipment, almost lingering, as if testing response times. Whoever it was knew what they were looking for and how to manipulate the system to avoid immediate detection. My pulse quickened. This was no longer random tampering. It was coordinated reconnaissance. I called Talia over, and together we began dissecting intrusions. We noticed subtle changes in several experimental setups. Nutrient levels altered, mislabeled plant samples, slight disruptions in soil composition. The scale of interference was beginning to paint a bigger picture. Someone was preparing to claim ownership through destabilization. The goal wasn't merely sabotage. It was to create the appearance that I was unfit to manage the lab. By late morning, I had set a countermeasure plan. Every vulnerable system was now under dual authentication. Every access logged and duplicated. Sensitive experiments were temporarily relocated to a separate, secure section of the lab. Micro cameras were positioned to capture any movement within a 3-meter radius, while strategically placed alarms would instantly notify me of unauthorized presence. This wasn't just security, it was intelligence. Every action I took would leave evidence, forcing anyone who acted against me to reveal themselves. While cataloging these measures, I noticed subtle discrepancies in the server logs. Several files had been accessed remotely during odd hours, and timestamps suggested a coordinated effort. Whoever had orchestrated this intrusion had intimate knowledge of the lab's internal network. My heart tightened. This wasn't just my family's interference anymore. It was a concerted attempt to manipulate proprietary research for personal gain. Determined, I began reconstructing the tampered logs. Every adjustment, Every erased entry was meticulously traced, revealing patterns and intentions. The pieces were falling into place. These intrusions were designed to leave a trail of chaos, to make it appear that I was incapable of managing the lab effectively. But every calculated move they made gave me an advantage. They were leaving me the breadcrumbs I needed to understand their strategy. By afternoon, I decided to take the fight beyond the lab. I drafted encrypted messages to contacts who had worked with my grandfather over the years, seeking confirmations of ongoing collaborations and past agreements. Each reply painted a clearer picture. My family had been systematically cutting me out, blocking access to vital communications, and manipulating perceptions to their benefit. The realization was sharp, almost painful, but it steeled my resolve. I wasn't just defending a lab. I was reclaiming a legacy deliberately hidden from me. The sun was sinking when I returned to the greenhouse. Shadows stretched across rows of test beds, the dust motes floating in sunlight like slow, silent witnesses. I paused at Gideon's old desk, tracing the engraved initials in the polished wood. He had left me more than instructions. He had left me the tools to see through deception, to anticipate sabotage, and to act decisively. I felt the weight of that trust pressing down, but it energized me rather than intimidating. That evening, while reviewing footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A second intruder. They moved with precision, almost surgically, avoiding cameras and sensors that should have triggered alerts. But I caught a glimpse of their wristwatch, the faint reflection of light, the way they crouched to examine equipment with intent. This wasn't a lone figure. They were working with the first intruder, coordinated to maximize disruption. My family had escalated. I stayed late into the night, installing additional layers of security and creating false data trails, decoy experiments designed to mislead anyone attempting to steal intellectual property. Each decoy contained subtle tracking markers, allowing me to identify who accessed what, when, and from where. Every move, every countermeasure, was calculated to turn their own tactics against them. Finally, as midnight approached, I leaned back in Gideon's chair, exhaustion weighing on my shoulders. Outside, the bees hummed a quiet lullaby, oblivious to human schemes. I realized the lab wasn't just a place of science. It was a battleground. Every day, every hour, the conflict grew sharper, more intricate. My family's ambition was a force I had underestimated. But now, armed with insight, strategy, and the support of those who truly understood the lab's purpose, I felt ready. Sleep came reluctantly that night, a light, wary doze. The lab was silent, yet every creak, every rustle, felt loaded with potential threats. Tomorrow would demand sharper focus, more decisive action. The game had intensified, the web of intrusions growing more complex, and I knew with absolute certainty that the next move would set the stage for everything that followed. The next morning, Savannah's air was heavy with humidity, carrying the faint tang of river water and moss. The lab seemed calm at first, but I knew better. Calm was a veneer. Underneath it, danger had been brewing. The intrusions had revealed patterns. But now I needed more than observation. I needed to anticipate my family's moves and prepare for direct confrontation. I began by inspecting the lab from top to bottom. Every cabinet, every workstation, every data terminal received meticulous attention. Sensors were recalibrated, microcameras repositioned, and decoy files rechecked. I could not afford a single error. Every overlooked vulnerability would be exploited, and I could sense the rising tension like static electricity before a storm. While organizing the call logs and tracking anomalies, I discovered a pattern I had missed earlier. The intrusions always coincided with the family's public appearances or social events. It wasn't random timing, it was coordinated. My family was creating the perfect cover for their manipulations. The realization tightened my chest, but it also offered clarity. I could anticipate their moves, trap them, and gather proof simultaneously. Mid-morning brought the first direct challenge. A courier arrived at the lab carrying a package addressed to me, sealed with my grandfather's old emblem. I opened it carefully, expecting instructions or a warning. Inside was a single innocuous-looking notebook, but upon closer inspection, it contained handwritten notes referencing experiments and financial data I had kept separate. Someone had broken into my hidden archive and attempted to plant evidence, perhaps to confuse or discredit me later. The audacity was staggering, but it also confirmed my suspicions. My family was willing to risk exposure to manipulate the narrative. I spent the afternoon reviewing every piece of information I had gathered so far. Security footage, call logs, tampered files, and now the planted notebook. All pieces of a puzzle that told a story of calculated betrayal. I began drafting a meticulous timeline of events, cross-referencing each intrusion with the family's movements. The connections were undeniable, and the evidence was mounting. Whoever attempted to manipulate the lab underestimated the intelligence and resolve my grandfather had instilled in me. By evening, I was ready to implement the next phase of my strategy: controlled exposure. I carefully embedded subtle tracking data within decoy project files, sending them out in controlled environments to see who would attempt to access or distribute them. Each decoy was designed to appear valuable, but contained markers that would reveal the identity of the intruder. I knew this was risky, but the only way to fully understand the scope of my family's interference was to let them act and then catch them in the act. As night fell, I conducted another perimeter check. The greenhouse was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the bees outside. I moved along the rows of flowering plants, noting the precise alignment of the irrigation system, the subtle angles of sunlight on the test beds, and the placement of sensitive equipment. Every detail mattered. Even the smallest misalignment could indicate tampering. The first intruder returned, cautious, almost testing the boundaries of my defenses. I watched them through a micro camera, noting their movements and documenting every action. By midnight, I had begun creating a secondary layer of security, a digital breadcrumb trail that would expose the identity of anyone accessing the decoy files. Every click, every login attempt, every copied document would feed into a monitored system. Whoever thought they could sabotage or steal my grandfather's legacy would leave proof in plain sight. I leaned back in Gideon's old chair, feeling a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The game had intensified, but for the first time, I felt confident that I was no longer reacting. I was leading. I spent the remainder of the night reviewing the decoy responses. A pattern emerged. The intrusions were coordinated, timed, and executed with precision. It wasn't just my family. It was a network of associates, insiders, and opportunists, all acting to undermine my claim. I realized that to protect the lab, I had to do more than defend. It was time to turn their own tactics against them. The first light of dawn revealed a lab alive with potential. I moved deliberately, checking every sensor, every camera, and every sample. The bees outside worked in silent harmony, unconcerned with human schemes, a living reminder that persistence and focus yielded results even in the face of opposition. I resolved that morning that I would no longer let my family manipulate my grandfather's legacy. Every move they made would be anticipated, every deception documented, and every betrayal exposed. As the sun rose higher, I began preparing for the confrontation that I knew was inevitable. The lab had become a battlefield, and I was both the guardian and the strategist. Every experiment, every sensor, every data point was part of a plan to protect not just the lab, but the vision my grandfather had entrusted to me. And I knew that the next encounter would define the course of this silent war. The morning fog clung stubbornly to Savannah streets, curling around the moss-draped oaks like a warning. I felt it in my bones before I saw it. The tension of anticipation, the subtle awareness that today the quiet war in the lab would spill into the daylight. I arrived early, the gravel crunching sharply beneath the tires. Every step a reminder that I was finally taking the fight beyond monitors and sensors. The lab itself hummed with life. The plants, bees, and meticulously organized equipment formed a rhythm that I had grown accustomed to, an order I could trust, unlike the chaos outside. As I entered the greenhouse, I reviewed the security footage from the past week. Multiple attempts have been made to access sensitive data, each one more brazen than the last. One of the intruders had left fingerprints on a terminal. Another had bypassed a motion sensor by moving with precision that betrayed prior knowledge. The sophistication of these intrusions indicated more than casual curiosity. It was orchestration, calculated and persistent. I began setting up additional countermeasures. Micro cameras were repositioned to cover blind spots. The irrigation and nutrient systems were linked to dual alerts. and decoy data files were carefully distributed throughout the network. Every action I took was both defensive and offensive, designed not only to secure the lab, but to catch anyone who dared to manipulate it. By mid-morning, I noticed unusual movement outside. A sleek, black SUV was idling at the edge of property, a car I didn't recognize, but immediately associated with deliberate observation. Its occupants remained in the vehicle, silent and still, almost too casual. I recorded their presence and kept them under watch, knowing that someone had come to test boundaries, and I needed to be ready for confrontation. Hours passed, and the intruders did not act immediately. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, perhaps for a lapse in attention. I could feel the anticipation building. The game was no longer just about stealth. It was about pressure, intimidation, and psychological warfare. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. The world needs your eyes. It wasn't just about vigilance. It was about insight, about predicting moves before they happened. As the afternoon light poured through the greenhouse, the first visitor entered the lab. It wasn't someone I recognized at first glance, but the aura of authority and entitlement was unmistakable. It was a distant cousin, someone who had long whispered doubts about my competence, now stepping boldly into the space I had meticulously fortified. Their expression was calm, controlled, but there was an underlying calculation in their eyes, one that hinted at years of careful planning. I greeted them with a measured nod, my voice even, betraying nothing. Every detail mattered. The tilt of their head, the tightening of their jaw, the subtle glance at equipment they had no right to see. I could feel the silent challenge. They expected hesitation, error, perhaps even fear, but I was neither hesitant nor fearful. I had spent weeks preparing, anticipating, and strategizing. The lab was my domain, and today would prove it. The cousin moved deliberately, examining data terminals and experimental setups, as if trying to assess the lab's vulnerabilities. I tracked every step through micro cameras and subtle markers I had placed. Every file accessed, every instrument touched, was logged and cross-referenced. The evidence was accumulating, and I felt a sense of empowerment. For the first time, I realized the lab was not just a defensive stronghold. It was a tool for revelation. Every intrusion, every attempt to manipulate or undermine would be documented and exposed. By evening, the presence of multiple observers outside became evident. Through strategically placed cameras, I could see figures pacing near the perimeter, lingering near the fence lines, watching for any sign of weakness. They believed they could intimidate me, force errors, or extract concessions through proximity and pressure. Instead, I felt clarity, control, and an unexpected surge of confidence. I spent the night compiling evidence, linking each intrusion to the corresponding family member or associate. Digital footprints, time-stamped entries, video recordings, and tampered files all formed a narrative of deliberate interference. The complexity of the plot was staggering, but every step they took left a breadcrumb trail, and I was following it. Each action, each misstep, brought me closer to exposing not only their intentions, but their vulnerabilities. By midnight, I paused in Gideon's office, reviewing the growing dossier. Outside, the bees were silent, clustered in the cool night air, a reminder of persistence and order. Inside, I realized the magnitude of the confrontation that was unfolding. It was no longer hypothetical. It was immediate. My family's ambition, carefully masked by etiquette and social expectation, had met the steadfast resolve of someone who knew every corner, every secret, and every contingency of the lab. Tomorrow would demand more than vigilance. It would demand strategy, foresight, and the courage to confront betrayal head-on. And as I finally rested, I understood that the first clash was only the beginning, the surface of a conflict that would soon reveal its full depth, and I would need every ounce of my grandfather's wisdom and my own ingenuity to see it through. The lab felt different the next morning. The air was thick, not with humidity, but with tension, as if the greenhouse itself sensed a brewing storm. Every leaf, every frame of bees, every meticulously organized row of seedlings seemed to hum with anticipation. I had spent weeks preparing for this, but the real test had arrived, unmasking the betrayal that had infiltrated my grandfather's legacy. I started by reviewing the decoy files I had strategically distributed. Each one contained hidden markers, metadata, tracking codes, and embedded logs that would reveal unauthorized access. As I sifted through the alerts, I noticed an unmistakable pattern. The files had been accessed during periods that coincided with my family's social engagements and private meetings. But one access, in particular, stood out, a series of interactions that pointed directly to my sister, Sienna. She had not only attempted to manipulate the data, but had also coordinated with external parties, trying to gain financial leverage before I could secure the lab's projects. My hands shook, not with anger, but with a cold clarity. Years of subtle manipulation, subtle undermining, and quiet obstruction were all connected now, and the evidence was irrefutable. Sienna's carefully maintained facade of innocence had been shattered by her own ambition, leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs that mapped every deceptive move she had made. I turned to the call logs, meticulously cross-referencing each entry with her known movements and appointments. The pattern was undeniable. Messages had been sent, inquiries made, and instructions given, all designed to redirect potential collaborators, intercept key data, and discredit my claim to the lab. My heart raced as the implications sank in. This was a mere sibling rivalry. It was a calculated attempt to wrest control from the only person my grandfather had trusted with his vision. The next phase required subtlety. I could not confront them directly. Not yet. Any premature action would tip them off, allowing them to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, or manipulate witnesses. Instead, I devised a strategy to gather live evidence while protecting the lab's operations. Every terminal they accessed would trigger alerts. Every digital footprint would be recorded, and every visitor's movement would be meticulously monitored. I became both the observer and the architect, creating a controlled environment where their intentions could be fully exposed. By afternoon, the first human intrusion occurred. I watched through microcameras as one of Sienna's associates entered the lab under the guise of routine inspection. Their movements were careful, rehearsed, but every step revealed unfamiliarity with the lab's true systems. They accessed files marked as Evergreen Project, believing them to be genuine. But in reality, these files contained tracking markers designed to reveal every transfer attempt. Each click, each download, each attempted alteration was meticulously recorded, sending encrypted updates to a secure cloud I controlled. The audacity of their operation was both infuriating and enlightening. My family's network extended further than I had anticipated, yet every action left a trace. Their overconfidence was their weakness, and I was ready to exploit it. I began constructing a timeline, aligning the intrusions with the metadata and call logs, building a map of deception that would be impossible to dispute. Evening came, and with it, a quiet satisfaction. The greenhouse was bathed in golden light, the bees working tirelessly, a reminder that productivity and purpose could withstand even the most insidious interference. I reviewed the evidence once more, tracing each act of betrayal, each attempt to undermine my authority, and each strategic misstep. Sienna had underestimated my preparation, my foresight, and my determination. I spent the night planning the next stage. I would not only secure the lab, but turn every deception into proof. Decoy meetings would be arranged, phone negotiations initiated, and every family member's action documented in real time. The objective was clear: expose their intentions, preserve my grandfather's legacy, and assert control over the lab. The betrayal would not go unpunished, not in the court of evidence, nor in the court of public perception. By midnight, I reviewed the lab's monitoring feeds one last time. Outside, shadows moved with deliberate caution, a reminder that the family was aware of my vigilance. Inside, the lab remained a sanctuary, its rhythm of bees, plants, and sunlight a stark contrast to the calculated chaos beyond its walls. I felt a sense of quiet triumph, tempered by the understanding that the battle had only just begun. The betrayal had been unmasked, the players identified, and the next moves carefully anticipated. Tomorrow I would escalate. Controlled exposure, strategic confrontation, and careful documentation would ensure that my family's manipulations were revealed in full. This was no longer about defense alone. It was about reclaiming authority, asserting my grandfather's vision, and ensuring that those who had sought to betray it would be held accountable. Every piece of evidence, every carefully laid trap, and every observation would culminate in a revelation they could not ignore. And I was ready. The dawn broke over Savannah with an almost cruel clarity. Sunlight spilled across the rooftops and streets, cutting through the morning mist like a spotlight, illuminating the world in sharp, unforgiving lines. For the first time since inheriting the lab, I felt the weight of the confrontation ahead. Today would not be about secret monitoring or covert observations. Today would be about strategy, demonstration, and subtly asserting authority over a family that had spent years undermining me. I entered the lab early, the gravel crunch under my feet familiar and grounding. The greenhouse was calm, the bees performing their intricate ballet, the plants responding to the soft warmth of the sunlight. Every corner of the lab had been optimized, fortified, and documented. I had prepared contingency plans, alternative entry protocols, and multiple layers of surveillance. Every act, every movement, every potential sabotage was accounted for. But the real test was not technical. It was psychological. I needed to make my presence known, not with aggression, but with an undeniable assertion of control. By mid-morning, the first visitors arrived. My sister, Sienna, her companion, and a junior family attorney stepped across the threshold as if they owned the place. The air changed immediately. Their confidence, cultivated over years of familial power, exuded in every step and gesture. Yet, beneath the surface, I could sense hesitation, subtle micro-expressions, fleeting glances at instruments and terminals they had no right to access. They assumed the lab could be dominated through intimidation, but they had underestimated my preparation. I greeted them with a calm, deliberate nod, careful to maintain neutrality in my tone and posture. They attempted to examine the lab's operations, probing the decoy files, assessing the hardware, and scrutinizing the greenhouse layout. Each movement was documented by the hidden cameras and sensors. Every attempt to manipulate data flagged in real time. They did not realize that every step they took was leading them further into a web of evidence I had designed specifically to expose their intentions. As I watched, I could see the tension rise. Sienna, ever the meticulous strategist, tried to mask her frustration with a practiced smile, but faltered when she noticed my careful observation and the subtle cues I had planted throughout the lab. The junior attorney, usually the confident orchestrator of legal posturing, hesitated at a terminal, uncertain whether the file he was accessing was genuine or part of a controlled narrative. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each moment of careful observation. The morning progressed, and I maintained an appearance of calm neutrality while subtly controlling the narrative. Every instruction I gave, every answer I provided, was measured to reinforce my authority. They were caught between the illusion of access and the reality of my preparedness. The lab was not just a workspace. It was now a controlled environment designed to reveal deception and expose hidden agendas. By noon, the pattern of interference was undeniable. Through cross-referencing call logs, visitor access, and digital interactions, I mapped the network of manipulation. My sister's coordination with external parties, attempts to intercept communications, and strategic misinformation were clear. Her elaborate schemes have been unmasked not through confrontation, but through meticulous planning, observation, and the careful placement of evidence markers. I allowed the morning to stretch, letting tension build without acting overtly. Every minute they spent in the lab reinforced the narrative. I was in control, I understood the operations, and I had anticipated every move. Their patience frayed, subtle missteps began to emerge, and my observations recorded them all. The more they tried to assert dominance, the more evident it became that their strategy was flawed. By mid-afternoon, Sienna and her companion had grown increasingly agitated. Their attempt to manipulate the decoy files, access sensitive equipment, and assess potential vulnerabilities were increasingly desperate. Every click, every gesture, every movement was being logged and time-stamped, building an incontrovertible dossier of intent and interference. I knew that by nightfall, the evidence would be irrefutable. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows through the greenhouse, I gathered the data and cross-referenced it with my grandfather's original notes, call logs, and the tracking information embedded in the decoy files. The story was complete. Each intrusion, every attempt to control, and every act of deception was documented in meticulous detail. I had achieved the first major victory without a single direct confrontation. The evidence spoke louder than words ever could. The family would not leave the lab that day without knowing that the balance of power had shifted. My grandfather's legacy, carefully entrusted to me, was no longer a quiet inheritance, but an active demonstration of oversight, strategy, and control. I had unmasked the betrayal, and the first confrontation had solidified my position. The lab was mine to protect, and the consequences of interference were now visible, undeniable, and traceable. Night had fallen over Savannah, the city's lights flickering in the distance like distant stars reflected on water. In the lab, the silence was profound, broken only by the softening of the greenhouse systems and the occasional rustle of bees returning to their hives. After a full day of observation, documentation, and subtle confrontation, I finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. The path ahead was clear. It was time to finalize the exposure, to reveal the full extent of betrayal, and to ensure that my grandfather's legacy would not only survive but thrive under my stewardship. I began by compiling the evidence. Every intrusion, every intercepted communication, every alteration attempt was meticulously logged. I created a comprehensive dossier, files marked with exact timestamps, screenshots of tampered data, cross-references to call logs, and notes detailing the pattern of deception. Each entry was precise, unassailable, and ready for presentation. This was not just about winning a family battle. This was about proving that the lab, the research, and the innovations my grandfather had left behind could not be controlled by greed, manipulation, or superficial appearances. Once the dossier was prepared, I moved to the second phase of my plan, controlled exposure. I had already tested the decoy files, and the tracking metadata confirmed that any further tampering would be recorded. I initiated carefully designed phone negotiations with potential partner, one that Sienna and her allies would naturally attempt to influence. Every access, every attempt to manipulate or intercept the project was logged, creating a live feed of their intentions. This was a trap I had set, and the pieces were now falling into place. Late into the night, the first signals appeared. Alerts from the decoy files indicated that someone had tried to transfer sensitive project information. The system identified the source, a device associated with my sister's circle. Her strategy, confident and overreaching, had led her straight into the web I had woven. Every step she took now reinforced a narrative, building an irrefutable case of interference. I allowed the alerts to continue, each one providing a clearer picture of the depth of her ambition and the lengths she was willing to go to undermine the lab. By early morning, I reviewed the data and realized something critical. The pattern of interference wasn't limited to Sienna. Subtle, almost imperceptible anomalies suggested that other family members had been complicit, whether knowingly or through passive acquiescence. It was a web of loyalty, deception, and control, layers of influence designed to keep the lab under the family's thumb. The stakes were higher than I had anticipated, but the plan I had meticulously constructed was sufficient. I would expose every participant, every attempt at manipulation, and every act of betrayal without ever compromising the integrity of the lab. The following day, I executed the final stage. Carefully, I released a controlled statement to Savannah's media, accompanied by photographs and excerpts from my grandfather's letters. His words, deliberate and unmistakable, outlined why the lab had been entrusted to me, highlighting the values of responsibility, innovation, and environmental stewardship. The release was designed to attract attention without revealing vulnerabilities. It was factual, irrefutable, and framed the lab's purpose in the most favorable light. Within hours, the response was overwhelming. Community forums, local news outlets, and social media erupted with discussion. The lab was praised as a groundbreaking initiative, a testament to sustainable practices and environmental responsibility. Simultaneously, the internal strategy was in motion. The digital logs, called records, and tampering attempt compiled over weeks were now ready to be presented in a controlled forum. This evidence would be delivered to legal authorities, ensuring that any interference would have consequences far beyond the confines of family dispute. By late afternoon, I confronted my family one final time, not with anger, not with shouting, but with the quiet authority of preparation and evidence. The dossier, comprehensive and unassailable, lay on the lab's conference table. Each page, each timestamp, and each note told a story of deliberate interference and calculated betrayal. The weight of the documentation was enough. There was no room for denial. They could not argue with the sequence of events, the recorded attempt at deception, or the clear digital footprints leading directly to them. Sienna's expression faltered first, a mixture of disbelief and realization. The junior attorney, her accomplice, could not maintain his composure as the evidence unfolded, revealing a network of deception that extended beyond what he had anticipated. Even the more distant relatives, previously passive observers, recognized the inevitability of the outcome. The lab, the research, and the legacy of my grandfather were now undeniably under my control. In the quiet that followed, I felt the culmination of weeks, months, and years of preparation. The betrayal had been exposed, the manipulations documented, and my grandfather's vision secured. The lab was no longer just a collection of plants, bees, and scientific equipment. It was a symbol of accountability, foresight, and resilience. I had transformed what could have been a story of familial conflict into a demonstration of integrity, intelligence, and dedication. As evening fell, I walked to the greenhouse, the golden light casting long shadows over the rows of plants. The bees moved with purpose, entirely undisturbed by human schemes or greed. I stood among them, feeling the hum of life, and realized that the fight had not been about ownership alone. It had been about stewardship, responsibility, and protecting what truly mattered. My grandfather's legacy was safe, and the lessons of vigilance, strategy, and integrity were now mine to carry forward. Tomorrow, the final chapter would be written, not as a confrontation, but as a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unwavering commitment to safeguard a vision that transcended personal gain. Every act, every plan, every careful decision had led to this moment. And for the first time in years, I felt the calm certainty of a future defined by control, respect, and the unshakable principles my grandfather had instilled in me. The morning arrived quietly, the sunlight soft and deliberate, as if nature itself understood the magnitude of the day ahead. The savanna air was warm but carried a certain tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of the reckoning that had begun the night before. I walked through the lab, each step deliberate, each movement carrying the weight of weeks of preparation, planning, and strategy. The greenhouse was alive with sound, the soft hum of bees, the subtle rustle of leaves, the quiet drip of condensation. But there was also a sense of stillness, an anticipation that something significant was about to unfold. The lab no longer felt like just a building filled with equipment and plants. It had become a fortress of accountability, a sanctuary of legacy, and a stage upon which truth would finally take its place. I reviewed the dossier one last time. The meticulous documentation of interference, tampering, and betrayal stacked neatly on the conference table. Every timestamp, every call log, every recorded attempt to manipulate the project was cataloged, cross-referenced, and validated. Nothing had been left to chance. My grandfather's voice echoed through the letters and notebooks, a silent guidance reminding me of the responsibility I carried, not just to him, but to the vision he had nurtured, to the lives that had benefited from his quiet work, and to the integrity of the lab itself. By mid-morning, the first of the family arrived, cautiously, almost hesitantly. Their previous attempts at intimidation had failed, and now there was a palpable uncertainty in their demeanor. Sienna's face, usually so composed and smug, carried a shadow of doubt. My mother's carefully constructed poise wavered, her gaze flicking nervously toward the lab's instruments, the unseen cameras, and the evidence that had been laid bare. My father's hands, once clasped in confident authority, now trembled slightly as he approached, the weight of their own misdeeds pressing down upon him. I allowed them to enter fully, letting them see the lab in its entirety, the careful organization, the precision of the experiments, the order that could not be argued with. Every aspect of the space spoke to preparation, discipline, and stewardship. I did not speak immediately. Silence, measured and purposeful, allowed the tension to build, letting them feel the certainty of the position I had carved for myself. Then, deliberately, I began to present the evidence. Page by page, timestamp by timestamp, attempt by attempt, I revealed the patterns of interference. Sienna's attempt to access files, manipulate data, and intercept communications were laid bare. Calls she had coordinated, attempts she had made to pressure external parties. And the metadata, showing exactly how she had tried to influence the project. All were displayed in irrefutable clarity. Her confidence faltered further with every page, and I could see her calculating, reconsidering, and realizing that her maneuvers had been anticipated, monitored, and neutralized from the very beginning. But it was not just Sienna. The evidence also implicated other family members, passive accomplices who had allowed manipulation to occur, whose silence had enabled betrayal. The narrative that had been constructed in whispers, in subtle pressure, in carefully hidden actions, was now exposed in its entirety. The labyrinth of deception they had created had been methodically untangled, each thread documented, each intention revealed. The lab was no longer just a scientific endeavor. It was a mirror, reflecting their actions back at them with unflinching clarity. The moment of reckoning came slowly, deliberately. I watched as realization dawned on them, one by one. My mother's attempts at smirking or dismissing the evidence were futile against the meticulous record I had compiled. My father's eyes, previously a shield of authority, now carried the weight of awareness, and understanding that the games they had played for decades had been rendered irrelevant by preparation, strategy, and the careful orchestration of truth. Finally, I addressed them, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the quiet, deliberate authority that comes from certainty and preparation. I reminded them of my grandfather's vision, of the values he had instilled, of the responsibility that the lab represented. Every word, every phrase, was measured to reinforce the fact that control, oversight, and dedication were now unequivocally mine. I did not need to threaten. The evidence spoke for itself, and the presence of accountability left no room for argument. As the day drew to a close, the family departed, leaving the lab in silence, the echo of their misjudgments lingering like a faint shadow. The greenhouse returned to its natural rhythm. The bees continued their work. The plants reached toward the fading sunlight, and the quiet hum of life persisted, untouched by human greed. I stood among them, feeling the culmination of months of planning, years of preparation, and decades of legacy resting in my hands. The lab, the research, and the vision my grandfather had entrusted to me were now secure, fortified not just by walls and locks, but by evidence, foresight, and unwavering stewardship. That night, I walked through the lab one last time before locking the doors. The letters, the notebooks, the evidence, all were in order, carefully stored, and ready for any future challenges. I paused at the greenhouse entrance, watching the golden light of the setting sun illuminate the plants and hives. For a long moment, I allowed myself to simply breathe, to feel the presence of my grandfather's guidance, and to appreciate the victory not in terms of inheritance, but in terms of responsibility, integrity, and the preservation of a vision that transcended personal ambition. The legacy was secure. The betrayal had been exposed. The lab, my grandfather's life's work, and the promise of a future rooted in stewardship, science, and ethical responsibility were now mine to protect. And as I finally closed the doors, the quiet hum of the greenhouse, the meticulous order of the lab, and the certainty of preparation reminded me of the truth I had always known. Some inheritances are measured not in wealth, but in responsibility, vision, and the unwavering commitment to protect what truly matters. I turned off the last light, the hum of the systems echoing like a heartbeat. The lab was mine. The bees continued their work, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile, not from triumph over family, but from the quiet satisfaction of fulfilling a legacy that had been entrusted to me, fully and unshakably.